Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Michael Freebley. You may see me on Crossroads and other programs. I'm a senior associate with CRTKL here in Dallas, the neighbor to the ADX that I haven't been in since March. But would like to welcome you today to an impromptu discussion, which it really is. Had the chance to meet with Florian Eidenberg while he's in town from New York, and we started talking a couple weeks ago about what culture was like in Dallas currently at the moment, and the way that we're seeing things like districts, museums, even the expression of culture in our neighborhoods, or even just how we define in our city. And I think what you're going to see today is just sort of a potluck of sorts of what we brought to the table in terms of just some of our thoughts on what we've seen. But, you know, it's interesting. I think just as we talked about what it would be, you know, Dallas is a city that's constantly changing and constantly evolving. And so, you know, the question is, you know, has Dallas had its own culture for some time? And we kind of felt like it is emerging at the moment into something quite unique and quite special. So the guests that are with us today, and I'll let each of them introduce themselves, you know, as they speak, but each have a play in that, but also just a perspective on that as well. So it's gonna be a pretty loose discussion. We're just gonna kind of go through some slides at the beginning on our thoughts, and then we're gonna just follow it up with a discussion led by Texas architects Aaron Seward, and then open it up for Q&A throughout the process. So actually, if you see anything throughout the presentations and you want to pose some questions to us, just put it into the chat. Aaron will rifle off some of those at the end. We may stick to an hour, we may not, we'll see. But you know, it's just, I think it'll be a pretty good discussion here. So without further ado, I'll kick it off here. And, you know, the things that I was talking about with culture was something that came up in our conversation because Florian was asking me about, you know, what is local Dallas? And that's something that we often think about in practice because, and I think this image sums it up, that's at the front of the Prairie's Yield that was published in '62. This was in '45, but there's always this contrast of what Dallas was and what Dallas is becoming. And it seems like more and more the balance of this image is constantly changing. Now, most of these steer that you see in the foreground are sort of encased in bronze outside the convention center. So things have quite changed since then. I don't think the slide change is working. So, there we go. But, you know, I mentioned the Prairie's Yield, and I think it's a very important publication in the history of Dallas, published in 1962 for the convention by architects. But it runs parallel sort of the history of Dallas architecture with the timeline of progression. What's interesting throughout the book is that you see sort of how far behind we are with the world. So like you have the Chicago School coming in the Adolphus at the same time as the glass skyscraper by Mies van der Rohe, and how much it really catches up toward the end to this final spread where it basically talks about we don't necessarily know where this ship is heading. We just hope it's heading in an interesting direction. And I think it's been that for some time since '62, but there's been sort of this special connection with people as we've seen immigration in very large numbers to the city, both domestically and internationally. This was the scene of a Christian gathering before Woodall Rogers was built, and was sort of the precursor of Clyde Warren Park in some ways. But how uniquely people sort of use space and use periods of time in Dallas in very unique ways. And I think we've learned from those throughout our past. But I thought about this in practice because I think, you know, for RTKL and Callison RTKL, you know, when we first started really kind of experimenting with what culture meant in the city, it was really through kind of the sense of planning. So you had areas like Mockingbird Station, State and Thomas, Addison Circle. There were kind of these just broad strokes of how do we start to create a sense of community in places where it's really a blank slate at the moment. Most of those places have evolved over time, and we have sort of as a practice too, because we don't necessarily focus locally. We focus locally and internationally at the same time. But it's interesting now, you know, for me being at the practice, and I think we're really about sort of our own identities within our work, within our teams coming to light in projects. would say more and more we're using what we learned internationally to sort of lend itself to an experience locally and the ways that we're seeing the culture of places. I talk a little bit about workplace here because I think stuff that we're doing overseas right now, is sort of taking identity and sort of manifesting it as a way of building community within our projects. And I think there's something that could be learned from this throughout Dallas in the things that we're building, rather than just having campuses surrounded by parking lots. We talked about a couple examples earlier today as we were going around Dallas. There's a potential to work things in there such as nature, connection to people, understanding that the diagram that you're creating or the sense that you're creating isn't necessarily rooted just in the metrics, it's rooted in the people and the cultures that are experiencing it. So one example, of an experimentation downtown, since we'll get into the arts district, is with AT&T. At a time, or for some time, AT&T and a good friend in Andrew Barnes, if he's on the call now, hello from wherever you are, often talks about how AT&T builds the ugliest buildings in the city. And I think, we had that for some time in the Whitaker Tower, but, the ground level was interesting, but it was somewhat out of scale for some time. And before the Discovery District, we were asked to propose a concept at Ross and Field on what sort of blank slate could become in terms of creating a company culture and a company identity. So in this case, we literally pulled the street up. Our client called it a catcher's mitt. And so we thought, well, if the catcher's mitt's sort of catching people coming into downtown and becoming the icon, or for them to sort of understand the city, maybe we could pull it up in a sense in volume to become the real essence of the company. So you start to see, how building maybe dissolves a bit to start to welcome areas of the city into the conversation. So bridging over San Jacinto and creating pedestrian San Jacinto, the building actually starts to circle itself around the view of a public housing building next to it, so that it maintains their view of the sunset and their view of the horizon. And how the building starts to form sort of naturally around its context starts to create opportunities so that the company could build its culture internally. So the idea that the building sort of evokes the life of AT&T to the way that it responds to the city, engaging it in very unique ways, maintaining that view. This is one of my favorites just because you still see the building in the middle, and that was really the intent. But also its nod that it gives to the skyline. But also, I think the most important image was the one of creating a ground level that's highly connected. And even as you go up through the tower, the levels start to erode toward the edges, so they become areas of volume and areas of experience that connect across visually. And then we had to find a place for the Golden Boy at the base, the spirit of communication, which has gone from rooftops in Manhattan to business parks in Philadelphia, now to Dallas, which is currently in the Discovery District today, if you want to go see it. And I think that area today, covers some of this essence of, bringing community together at the ground level. But, I think it was interesting to sort of experiment with it in a different way. But ultimately, what I think defines local in Dallas is moments in time. This was my most powerful moment, was being at Thanksgiving Square and seeing it really come to life shortly after the police shooting. It was a powerful moment where the space, I think, was filled with its original intent of being a place for contemplation, a place to uncover pain, grief, connect as a community, and connect as a city. Really, the true essence of what it meant was something that came out of a horrific day in Dallas's history with JFK. The contrast of a day to happen so quickly was quite impactful to the city, to the point where they had self-labeled themselves the city of hate. And so it was Peter Stewart's efforts with business leaders and downtown groups to sort of understand how to create a place where we can heal, be together, and give thanks. So you see Philip Johnson's renderings here of how that was manifested in downtown. A landscape that's coveting and respecting the sort of contemplation, and then the chapel sort of rising up a bit heroically to the sky to connect, but also symbolize this place of universal use. So it wasn't necessarily just for Christians or Muslims, it was for everyone to experience in downtown. But for Texas Architect, I had the opportunity after the vigil to really think about what Thanksgiving Square meant to downtown. And Leonard Fermansky did a great kind of photo essay of what it was like in the day in the life. And it tells a story here that, while the space still maintains some of that kind of like iconic nature of it, and it still had events for contemplation, at the same time, it was misunderstood with the growth of downtown Dallas. Some thought of it as a park, some thought of it as a place to just kind of hang out. And so for the foundation, it really became a question of what this place means sort of in current Dallas time. And so over the last 8 months, we've been essentially in a conversation with the foundation, working with their leaders, as well as even architects and designers around the city. We even had Alan Ritchie, Philip Johnson's partner, in these conversations about how we could evolve Thanksgiving Square to sort of meet new demands, but also maintain its sense of purpose that it always embodied. So, we've started to look at it through, I think, these kind of like sketches in a way. But some thoughts on, the cultural space that this sort of evokes is really about sort of maintaining its true essence within the walls that we've all experienced around the outside, sort of covet the experience that Johnson intended on the inside, but then stitch it together more with the outside, the city. Amy Lewis Hofflin, who's on the board, put it very well that Thanksgiving needs to be about outward giving just as much as it is about inward thinking. So we started to see how we could update the space just very strategically, but open up views, bring some of the intent back, but even start to take the things like ADA that were necessary to update this and bring it up to code and up to speed, and sort of bring those around the outside as opportunities to teach you about the square, but not necessarily inhibit your view or your experience internally. The one piece that I think we've started to look at is sort of this pavilion on the edge. Nonprofits have shown a lot of interest in Thanksgiving Square as a place to gather and a place to even call home. And we're thinking like, could the tunnels become a place where you give space essentially for free? And we create this pavilion that sort of welcomes you into it. With these angles and pitches that you see, it was really about kind of capturing the sort of conflicting nature of the street grid in Dallas, and sort of punctuating the end of the site. But I think this evokes to me, probably the way that we're seeing culture sort of explored in Dallas in a way is this kind of marriage between, the original intent, but also just very respectfully engaging with it. I think this is one of the moments that I think is probably the most powerful in the project, is just the opportunity to bring people in off the street and really make it a space that's accessible without compromising the intent of what was behind Thanksgiving Square. And that's an ongoing conversation, really. But I think that's where it tails into our upcoming conversations with Lily Weiss, is really about, architecture does it one way, but obviously through the Dallas Arts District, there's other examples of efforts being done. So with Lily, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you, Michael. I guess I'm going to have to coordinate the. All right. So I'll wait just a minute. Hello, everyone. And I just want to thank everyone here on the panel for inviting me to be a part of this. And the first slide that I'm going to use, and I have very few slides, and a short video at the end, because it pretty much encapsulates what the Dallas Arts District is now in 2020, or in this time period. But if you look at this, and the older photos I could have used, but anyone on this Zoom panel as attendees, you may not have a reference unless you know Dallas. So I decided to use these two images. And the first one on the left, you can see the back of the Dallas, actually aerial of the Dallas Museum of Art, which is the first cultural institution that moved into this cultural district. And I'll back up just a little bit. The visionaries in Dallas really questioned whether they should bring the larger cultural institutions into one neighborhood. And as they met, they actually looked all around the city and they wanted to activate downtown. This was in 1983, and they chose the northeast corner of downtown Dallas. At that time, there were dairies, there were car lots in this area of downtown. And so it has obviously transformed. And Dallas Museum of Art, which is at the forefront of the picture on the left, is looking out on Flora Street, which is the cultural spine of the Dallas Arts District. And you can see the IMP building, the Morton Meyerson Symphony Center on the left, a couple of blocks down Flora Street. Those were the only two in 1984 and then 1989. This is meant to be a mixed use neighborhood, culture, commerce, retail, residents. And I have to say that the majority of the cultural venues entered the Arts District first. 1984 was Dallas Museum of Art. And I will say the first corporate building, and you can see it in the right-hand picture, is Rockefeller Center that just experienced a multi-million-dollar renovation to bring it up to 21st century urbanism in Dallas. So I just want to give you that scope. The beauty of this neighborhood is it combines the history, which we have 4 historic buildings in the neighborhood, 3 historic, actually 2, 3, 4, 5 historic buildings, 3 historic churches, 1 historic high school, and 1, it's the Moreland Y, that is a cultural venue, and it's the cultural institution, the home of Dallas Black Dance Theater. So we have a mixture of historic buildings and Pritzker Award-winning architectural buildings for the cultural venues. And then you have now a mixture of current corporations and a hotel that actually moved in last year. So let's see if, oh, I could do it. That's what it looks like now. When you look at the red roofed building, the oval, that is the AT&T Performing Arts Center. And really it takes up with the Wiley across the street from it. It is the largest campus as part of the Arts District. But if you can see all the way down Flora Street, the foundation of the Arts District was with the Dallas Museum of Art. And close to the left-hand side of the screen is Lucy Billingsley's building, which is Billingsley Company, and that's One Arts Plaza. So when you think of the Arts District, it really started with a lot of the cultural venues from 1984. And then the recent buildings are the City Performance Hall, which is now called Moody Performance Hall, and it is on the left-hand side towards us. It's hard to describe with you all looking at it. And then the other, in 2012, that was built. In 2009, AT&T Performing Arts Center. So if you look at the east side of the Arts District, it really is the newer side, except the historic buildings, which is fantastic. And then you see on the right-hand side over a freeway, the incredible deck park called Clyde Warren Park that connected our neighborhoods in downtown to uptown to Victory. It has become the meeting place, the town square, as Michael mentioned. And then further down is the Perot Museum of Nature and Science. All those 3 were built in 2012. When you look at the corporate buildings that have now added into the Arts District, KPMG Plaza, it's Hall Arts at KPMG Plaza, again, One Arts Plaza. 1900 Pearl is one of the more recent ones. We just had the hotel open, Hall Arts Hotel open in December of 2019. And the residences just opened, finished and open. The only thing under construction right now is Atelier luxury apartments, and they are right between the Meyerson Symphony Center and the Nasher Sculpture Center. So when you look at this mixed use, we now have I think the head count was 26 restaurants. Those only came on in the last few years. So when we talk about this mixed use district, we are now coming into our own. And this is nearly 40 years later. So from 1983 to now, and the priority of the Dallas Arts District Foundation is to propose, which we are in the process with the city of Dallas, updated ordinances and a new guidance plan, which we worked with NVPJ out of Boston, Alex Krieger and Alan Mountjoy, the principal architects there, to work with our stakeholders and say just exactly what this conversation is about. How do we become more accessible? How do we open our doors? And I will say, Alex said it so well 4 years ago when I joined the organization and we started these meetings. He said, you need to be able to tear down the walls physically and metaphorically. So basically, what happened in the 80s is downtown Dallas was a commuter downtown. Everybody drove in and drove right back out as fast as they could. So Flora Street, the cultural spine of the district, was really this everything, the front doors open to Flora. Now what we realize is that Ross Avenue is a very important corridor in downtown Dallas, goes from really old East Dallas into West Dallas. And our back doors are open to, meaning the cultural venues, are actually towards Ross. Now, of course, our back doors are going to be towards Woodall Rogers. A lot of the stage doors or the loading docks come off of Woodall Rogers. But what we're really looking at is ADA compliance, safety, connectivity, and more multimodal living. So basically pedestrians, automobiles, bicycles, anything that we haven't even invented right now can occur. And we're really looking long-term, 45 years later. We're trying to connect. In fact, we're in collaboration with Downtown Dallas Inc., Billingsley Company, and Uptown Dallas with the Dallas Arts District, connecting what we call Ruth Street Gateway, the underpass that goes between Dallas Arts District and Uptown Dallas. And it's really important because Booker T. Washington High School for the Performing and Visual Arts actually parks underneath Woodall Rogers Freeway, adjacent to this connected roadway. So as we begin this discussion, it's extremely interesting to watch the process of a new master plan for the Arts District that really has not been addressed for over 35 years. And really looking at it, the best of the Sasaki plan and bringing it into 21st century. And how do we make this street activation extremely important? And it really is activation of downtown, whether it's Arts District or in the Uptown or at any of the parks for downtown Dallas, any of the parks. What we do realize as cultural identity in Dallas does not have to only locate itself in the central part of downtown. It really has to move out into every neighborhood in the city of Dallas. And so what I will leave my comments with is the fact that the city of Dallas Office of Cultural Affairs passed a new cultural plan for the city. And I know that Lizzie's gonna touch on this a little bit, so I won't go into it by tons, but all of us, meaning I want to say over 7,000 residents were involved in the idea of how do we get arts and culture in every neighborhood in the city of Dallas. And that's what this cultural plan addresses. And there are 6 major priorities. And I just know, and this was pre-COVID, this city does realize the importance of arts and culture in its place in the economic impact for the city. And I do believe that even post-COVID, the arts and culture are gonna play a very important role in economic recovery. What is interesting is that we finally have realized that arts and culture are really small businesses. And so hand in hand with everyone in the entire neighborhood, I think that one of the things that is important for us is the collaborative spirit that all of us have. And it's interesting, even sitting on this panel, my connections that go far back and even most recent. So I can't wait for Florian's presentation because he has a connection to Alex Krieger with NBBJ. So, you know, it's no longer 6 degrees of separation. It's much smaller than that. So I will end with a quick video, which really does say where Dallas Arts District is. And I need to go back for a moment. And I also know that Lizzie's going to talk about this. This neighborhood, the neighborhood that Dallas Arts District, the majority of the neighborhood, especially Flora Street, is one of our freedmen's towns in the city of Dallas. And I know that firsthand because my first career and the majority of my career was actually teaching at Booker T. Washington High School for the Performing and Visual Arts from 1978, when the visionaries were meeting exactly about this arts district. So it's important to me and to the city of Dallas to touch the history of where we are and how that relates and is relevant to today. So I will end my oops, I did forget about that. I'm going to go back. That is the Dallas Arts District Master Plan. It's called the Connect Plan. And that is the main goal. And we have 5 key strategies. And I'm sure you can go to it. But what I want to say to you is what we have all realized is that we all have a common goal. We have a common goal to make sure that everything that we do, whether it's corporate, residential, restaurants, park, churches, schools, we all want to be accessible to our communities. And I think that sense of place really does have something to do with our cultural identity in the city of Dallas. So now you can see the video, and I bet you, there we go.
In the heart of Dallas sits the largest contiguous urban arts district in the United States. This dynamic destination where culture, commerce, and community intersect is connected by one common thread: the Dallas Arts District. Working to enhance the value of the city's creative and economic life, this nonprofit organization is making Texas proud in a big way. The cultural and financial impact of the arts and artists in the Dallas community is vital. Our work champions the creative cultivation of these spaces built on the bedrock of collaboration, education, community, inclusion, and innovation. The impact is tremendous. 10 Dallas Arts District organizations impact the economy by over $400 million, resulting in a 44% financial impact of arts and culture to the entire city of Dallas. This impact results in over $43 million to the state and city, an investment that attracts 4.3 million local, national, and international visitors annually, including 500,000 students, and directly supports thousands of local jobs. From the food truck and art vendors, restaurants and hotels, to signature community events like the Pride Block Party, Dallas Arts Month-Changing Perspectives Block Party, the annual community breakfast, the Connect Master Plan, grant giving, and Through the Lens, a collaboration with Hall Group, curating stunning images from local photographers into one bespoke keepsake book. The Arts District is an iconic neighborhood, decorated with more buildings designed by Pritzker Award-winning architects than any location in the world, and houses a historic performing and visual arts high school next door to a world-class opera house. To date, the Dallas Arts District Foundation has awarded over 450 microgrants to both small and mid-sized Dallas arts organizations, totaling $1.2 million in grant distribution. These grants expand the potential of the local arts community by working to recruit new talent and bring in audiences, visitors, and businesses to downtown Dallas. The Dallas Arts District is the primary steward of our neighborhood institutions and fosters an unwavering spirit of collective cultures in North Texas. The Dallas Arts District's vision is to transform this dynamic destination for locals and tourists alike while creating a fulfilling urban live-work-play experience. This is our community, forever thriving with integrated and exemplary artistic, residential, cultural, educational, recreational, and commercial life. Let's continue to develop more jobs for the creative economy.
And this will segue into Lizzie McWillie, who I've known for quite a while, and I'm very excited to hear her presentation as well.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I feel like my thoughts are a little all over the place. So I was kind of responding to conversation that we had last week. And I think, Florian, I think it was something that you said about what culture that's instigated versus culture that evolves naturally. And I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Lizzie McWillie. I'm the director of urbanism at Building Community Workshop, which is a nonprofit community design center based in Dallas with offices in Brownsville and Houston as well. And I'm not going to talk about a specific project, but kind of a collection of thoughts based on work that we've done here in Dallas, including work on the cultural plan, collaboration with artists that we've done over the years, and then other community engagement. We work a lot in affordable housing and equitable development. So I was thinking about the idea of a cultural district and the idea of centralizing culture in one spot. And then the idea also of decentralization, thinking about, as Lily said, in the cultural plan, we talked a lot about how do we get arts and culture, how do we provide access across the city. And kind of the idea from an urban design perspective of creating a cultural district essentially from scratch. And what that means for a city like Dallas that's so spread out, so large, and has a lot of challenges when it comes to providing equitable access across the city for many different reasons. Next. So this is a map of Dallas. This is a map that we've been working on for a long time of neighborhoods in the city of Dallas. So trying to understand from residents' perspectives how they define their neighborhood names and boundaries. And so that little red piece in the center is the arts district. And you can see there's a lot of the city around the arts district. Next. And so then I was thinking about, Lily talked a little bit about the history of the arts district and its development. And this is the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts in Fair Park, which was the precursor to the Dallas Museum of Art's current location. So I was thinking about the relationship of the development of the arts district to Fair Park, which is in some ways, kind of its own cultural district. And the decision to move the museum, eventually to move the Puro from Fair Park to the arts district. And it's been a long time since I'd done this research. When I was an intern in an office that I'm at now many years ago, I did a research project about the development of the arts district and the previous institutions and kind of how they evolved. But I remember one of the reasons that was given for why they wanted to move the museum was for convenience, for access. But Fair Park is located, in the heart of residential neighborhoods. And so, I don't think that it was said explicitly, but, it's also in the heart of historically African-American neighborhoods. And so while Fair Park is located in close proximity to a lot of folks, it's not necessarily, or wasn't necessarily maybe the audience that the museum wanted. And so that was kind of part of the impetus in moving. Next, please. And as Lily mentioned, where they moved to was known as Freedman's Town. Also kind of connected to also known as Short North Dallas, connected to State Thomas. Freedmen's towns that were formed by formerly enslaved people kind of when Dallas was growing on the outskirts of the core of the city. And so I was also thinking about how Dallas has this tendency to erase histories, to erase what was there previously, and to not acknowledge or value certain kinds of culture, or certain types of art, and kind of what we think of when we say arts and culture, how that's tinged or impacted by this tendency to just kind of not even see these other histories and cultures because they're not what we value, and those tend to be communities of color or cultures, because Dallas does have a very rich history and culture, but they're not always valued the same as kind of what you might find in the DMA. Next. And so then thinking about, as Lily said, that there's this high concentration of Pritzker Prize winning architecture, and all of the investment that kind of went into this central place. Oh, no, that's okay. Next. So thinking again about centralization and decentralization, and thinking about, this was a report that UT Arlington did a couple years ago, what percentage of income do Dallas residents pay for transportation? And their report said that 99.1% of the population in transit-dependent core find transportation unaffordable. So you think about centralization of culture in the context of 99% of the population finding transportation unaffordable. Next. And inaccessible, generally speaking. Walking access to the transit station does not guarantee walkability. Physical distance to transit centers is a major barrier. And barriers to access were one of the major issues that people identified in the cultural plan. Next. And so I also wanted to highlight a few things about Dallas that I think are really exciting and unique in terms of the way that culture can also be seen in terms of in their locations in neighborhoods. Next. And I think out of all of the cities that I've lived in, the cultural centers that you find here in Dallas, I think are really unique and important and valuable in terms of their relationship and the role that they play in neighborhoods, supporting local artists, supporting neighborhood needs, and providing culturally specific and relevant programming. This is the South Dallas Cultural Center, which is located next to Fair Park. Next. And then this is the Latino Cultural Center, located not too far from here. And there's the Bathhouse Cultural Center, the Oak Cliff Cultural Center as well. Next. And then thinking also about cultural institutions in Dallas neighborhoods that are not part of the city's system, not part of, kind of what we've looked at previously, but are neighborhood-based cultural hubs. And this is the Pan-African Center, Pan-African Connection, located in South Oak Cliff. Next. And Sunset Art Studios, located also in Oak Cliff, that provides residency spaces, often for women of color. Next. And so I think that those institutions, those organizations are super important in thinking about what's needed in Dallas, what, the kinds of organizations that need to be supported, especially if we're thinking about equitable access to arts and culture in the city. And I thought that this was important in looking at, this is state arts agencies, so it's, Texas-wide, but I think gives an indication of kind of some of the challenges that Dallas, Texas faces in terms of valuing the arts and culture. This is a comparison of per capita appropriations to state arts agencies, and you can see it's 36 cents, which is on the lower end of things. Even Oklahoma is spending more than us. Yeah. Yeah, so I think, and this is fiscal year 2021, so it's current. Next. And then other challenges related to transportation and money is affordable housing. The city identified a 20,000 unit shortage of housing units, of affordable housing units. And in order to meet that, we were going to produce over 6,000 units a year for the next 3 years. And in 2018, we produced 320 out of 6,600 something. And so that's not sustainable when we think about artists and how to support a thriving arts and culture community. We need housing. And so I think you can't talk about arts and culture without talking about the larger system that it's a part of. Next. And then just recently, this arts and culture, this study about the losses that have been faced or that the cultural community has been facing as a result of COVID. And this was just 2.5 months in $3.65 million in financial losses. And this is to arts organizations. And so thinking about how important arts and culture is to Dallas, not only as a, emotional, creative force, but even economically, how much money the arts brings into the city. This is a big loss and potentially devastating to artists who are trying to make a living and a life here. Next. So I was trying to think of I had a point to any of this. And so these were some final closing thoughts. I think it's important to understand past investment. We look at the kind of centralization and decentralization of investment that have been made across the city of Dallas, of understanding how we've invested in the past in communities, and not only increasing that, but kind of understanding what it means to equitably invest in neighborhoods, arts and culture, which would include more money for artists and small arts organizations, especially artists of color and organizations led by people of color, more affordable housing, more community-based options, community-controlled, culturally specific. And then as architects, thinking about kind of the typologies, the two examples that I showed before of the art spaces, they're storefront based. And so kind of thinking through the opportunities that we might see in creating more of these spaces for neighborhood-based arts work and cultural work. And that's it. Thank you.
So I'm Florian Einenberg. Thank you, Michael, for putting this together, and Lily and Lizzie to suddenly jump in, and Aaron to come and moderate. We're architects in New York, me and my partner, Jing Liu, and our firm, Soil. We work a lot with cultural institutions around the world, and I thought it would be nice to speak about a few projects from elsewhere and from different scales, and think about, because it seems we're all on this panel in agreement that culture can connect, and that at the same time we need to tear down boundaries and find ways to, keep the connections between audiences, diverse audiences, and the cultural institutions. And so we work quite a bit with a number of cultural institutions, and in all cases and in all scales, the question is, what is authentic, and how do you create an authentic and real relationship, and how do you connect these various audiences? And I was very struck when I saw this image, which is from I think last year's fire or the fires before in LA. As you drive up the freeway, the sign for the Getty Center, while in a way the world is burning. What is our role? What is the role of our cultural institutions to engage in the narratives that people are really concerned about? And if you look at New York City now, you see that in some way, some of these institutions that we've always held very dear as sort of very central in our lives are also being challenged to stay in contact with and continue to be concerned about things that we all share as our concerns, and that can be about labor practices or ethics, but also, for instance, the environment is something that more and more is raising issues with how how is our culture funded, and how do we actually engage in those conversations. And so we've been trying to think about how can the arts organizations move or shift in a way from sort of an Apollonian temple for the arts to something that is really standing in the community, in the environment, engaged with the issues that specific audiences are concerned about. And so I wanted to just go through 3 projects that do that on different scales. So one is a temporary installation, the other is a museum, and the other is actually an arts district master plan. The first being up at this moment in the High Museum in Atlanta, with their own Pritzker Prize winning Renzo Piano building. And a challenge there to connect actually the institution to the city and to the audience behind. They have this beautiful piazza in front, but it is, it's a pretty cold and stark space. And so we were asked for this summer to actually make a temporary installation there that would bring in other audiences than the ordinary audience, and in some way would lower the threshold, if you want, or the boundary between the city and the institution. And so we were thinking about birds. We started to think about birds, but it was more actually the question, and I will explain, for whom do we make our cultural institutions, who has access, and how do we expand? And this is really a question, can we think of our places beyond just for humans even? Should we also not think about other forms of life for whom we make our spaces? It was a little bit of a provocation. It came out of the fact that the High Museum is very close to Piedmont Park, where there's 120 different bird species, and Atlanta itself is known for its canopy. It's one of the most greenest cities in the US. It's 40% covered with green. And so we thought, what is specific about this installation, and how can we construct an authentic or a real narrative that comes out of the place itself? And so this idea of the canopy as a place where that doesn't only provide cooling for humans, but also other forms of life, became sort of a part of the narrative. And then realizing that Atlanta is actually a migratory city where a lot of birds on their journey from north to south and backward, they actually stop in Atlanta. And so this idea of migration, and not just of birds, but also Atlanta as a city of migration, was also part of the conversation. And interestingly enough, we learned that even news comes from birds. Reuters was originally he had postal pigeons before he started the telegrams. And so there's a straight relationship between broadcasting and birds actually bringing the news. And then lastly, Atlanta is the city that, as a phoenix, rose out of the ashes, and 2 of their sports teams actually have birds in there. So in some way, the bird became, or we constructed a narrative that allowed this piece to tie it to its community and actually approach different and a variety of audiences. And then we spoke to the Atlanta Audubon Society, and they said, well, building places where birds and people thrive, what does that look like? And so we started to think, what do people do and what do birds do? And can we come up with an installation in some way where birds and humans can come together to lark, perch, flock, tweet, fledge, and fly? And so what would that look like? And so we started with this sort of sketch, an initial sketch, sort of a building on that canopy as a place where both humans and birds would come together. And the title or the idea of murmuration as the shape of a flock of birds as sort of a form, and how would we translate that form in a series of points that then ultimately would, become in a way captured as a pavilion form. So this is the temporary installation that is currently up, which has bird feeders, bird baths, seats to sit down. There is places to perch, and we have it's also actually there's foliage growing there for the birds to feed on as well. And so here you see the installation. It's a structure that it's basically a tensile structure, temporary installation that was built there and is currently there with misters and other places. Obviously during COVID, it's a tough place to convene together, but at the same time, what we realized is it became one of the most popular spots in the city this summer to at least feed your Instagram feed. And I think that idea as well of like, how do you connect to audiences, different audiences, different interests. And I think this is quite interesting that it did work very well also to expand sort of, the digital presence of the museum. It's up still, I think, for another month. It's movable and mobile, but it is, one of the things that we do on the scale of the temporary installation. The second project on a different scale is a museum we completed a few years ago for the University of California in Davis. And there the same question was, how do you bring an audience to see the arts that normally doesn't engage with the arts? It's an agricultural school. It's the ag school of the UC system. And so most of the students here, they are concerned with environmental issues, with cloning sheep and modifying crops, but not necessarily with entering a museum on a daily basis. And so the question was how to introduce the arts, the visual arts, to an audience that doesn't naturally is inclined to go to the museum. It was on the edge of campus there at the bottom. The center of the campus is in the heart. And so the question was how to bring the arts to this audience. And so we said we don't think this became sort of a metaphor, like let's think of this place as a productive place, something that is always changing, something that's very porous, something in which we can think about the environment, make the environment part of the experience, something where the students can be the own agents and tell their own stories. And so the idea of this large canopy where basically the campus just extends into the site, and it's covered by this very open porous roof. A lot of third spaces being created where students would come and study and maybe stumble upon and enter a gallery. So make it very easy, very accessible, and not necessarily this sort of journey where the museum becomes a hurdle or something that is well, people feel afraid to enter. So here you see it at the edge of campus, and the canopy in some way takes the language also of the landscape of the Central Valley up there, and the most important thing is that the environment becomes really tangible because of the shadow and the shadow patterns that are being produced by this canopy with their different orientation, their different density, and their different openness. As the sun moves over, the light continuously changes. And so these patterns and the light actually is integral part of the experience itself. And this is the front plaza of the museum. And we wanted to make specifically for an audience who thinks about the environment from the angle of agriculture and climate, how do you make that part of the cultural experience as well? And now this is a very lively place where students have their own arts installations, but they also come to study. There's a projection here on the wall. They organized movie nights there, and there's other places to come and hang out. So in some way, not necessarily making the gallery or the official art space part of the experience, but actually introducing sort of spaces in between that can, form that threshold between gallery and exterior. And the last project I wanted to end with is something that we haven't spoken about much, but actually operates on the scale of the Dallas Art District, which I thought would be interesting to talk about. It's a master plan we're currently working on in Melbourne, all the way on the other side of the world. And it has very similar challenges, I think, or basically questions that the arts district here is dealing with. So in the 60s, they built this arts center. So Melbourne is towards the north, and towards the south, there's a river. And they started in the 60s, very much like Lincoln Center as well, built the large theater, the large opera, and the large museum. And currently, and you see them here from top to bottom on the theater, the concert hall, and the museum, the NGV. And now they're planning an extension where there's going to be a commercial, contemporary wing in the bottom left of this image, and a ballet school and ballet institute. And so traditionally, it was along this boulevard, and it had these front doors, very formal, like the Museum Mile in New York, with these sort of, talking about tearing down walls, very, very institutional thresholds. And the challenge here was, how do we flip that around, actually create a much softer landscape, soften those entries, and change the audience flow towards the back, which was considered the back, now becoming the new front with these new institutions on the other end, while all the logistics actually go in underneath. So this is a covered park with all the loading and all the supply and a central plant all through the middle. And so we thought about landscape. And what was very interesting, of course, is if you think about landscape in Australia, and well, one interesting fact, for instance, is that 1% of the Australian population is Aboriginal, but 30% of Australian art is Aboriginal art. And so when you speak about landscape and we speak about gardens, you cannot deny conversations also about, what are the species that we're bringing in. And there's obviously a history of colonial gardens there, but we actually look very much at the sort of pre-colonial landscapes, and worked with a local landscape architect to develop a sort of spatial experience that has much more to do with Aboriginal culture and how the landscape is being experienced. And in that, we introduced, places for performance, places for gathering, places where you could dug under and live in between. And we also thought very much about sort of the experience through the day and night, because actually the night was also the moment when in Aboriginal culture, the stars were used to navigate the landscape. And so thinking of, what is this place throughout day and night is something that influenced this plan. So this is currently under development and actually is awaiting funding. And so hopefully as soon we also have such a nice video as Lily showed me that. Yeah. So that's it for my part. So Aaron is gonna lead everything now.
Wow, thank you, people. For an impromptu conversation, this has turned out to be really interesting, and I'm glad I made the drive up from Austin. So thanks for inviting me. Happy to be here. So what occurred to me as I listened to all of your talks is that when it comes to Dallas in particular and Texas in general, and the question of culture, I think most people don't think of Texas and culture in the same sentence. But actually, if we go back to the first image that Michael showed us of the cowboy and the cattle and then downtown Dallas in the background, and think about the figure of the cowboy itself, the cowboy is culture, and it's also a culture of hybridization. A combination of different peoples coming together in one figure. And so we might think of our true Texas culture, for what Texas is now, as a culture of hybridization. But that's not necessarily represented in our built environment. And it seems to me that a lot of what we've talked about with the development that's going on in the arts district here in Dallas, a lot of your work, Florian, and Lizzie, what you pointed out was that what we're trying to do is heal wounds that have been created by modernism and the destruction of urbanism, the destruction of cities. And so we're trying to bring culture back. And the question is that possible? Can we do it working in the framework that we have as a legacy from our previous generations? So when you think about healing wounds, the first thing I think about, of course, is doctors and this metaphor of medicine, and the fact that doctors have an oath to first do no harm, right? So I think that as we think about all of these projects that we've talked about, one of the first questions I think we always have to ask ourselves is, are we doing more harm, right? So I think if we can just go back to the beginning, Michael, if we can talk about Thanksgiving Square, the kind of central project that underpinned your talk, and talk about if you can talk about the project again in that way of what are you healing here, and what are you thinking about when you're, or are you aware that further harm could be done anytime that you put a shovel in the ground?
No, that's a great way to frame it. I think, in terms of this idea of like, think about how not to cause more harm. I think that's why you don't see the design change too much on the interior, because I think the foundation, at least his voice, that it's a place that could still be a place to gather. There's nothing much to really fix with Thanksgiving Square, other than sort of conveying what its purpose is to the city and to its community. But a lot of the attention, I think, is how you start to think about the edges and start to blur the edges so that it becomes more accessible. But I also think it becomes a place that feels like it is for everyone. And a lot of that comes into, and I think what the design starts to illustrate a little bit is not so much the final outcome in the images, but perhaps the needs that the foundation needs to consider. So like, I think we've uncovered opportunities to connect with nonprofit groups, talking about how this square, essentially with all of its kind of dead space underneath it at the moment, could become an opportunity where it's a nexus for nonprofits to be able to gather, to be able to meet, to be able to come together in community if they don't have a place to do so right now. It talks about the edge condition, like the walls are always part of the conversation, because it's like right now it looks like a fortress to many people, and it's like there's opportunities to soften that up so it becomes places where you can sit, you can be kind of part of the community. But we even talked about, by not changing the interior and still making a contemplative space, the life of the city around the exterior, there's a life that could also be sort of brought into the conversation as well. So starting to make places around it a bit more pedestrian oriented so that more public gathering can take place, so that you can host markets and things like that. But I'd say all in all, it's to not cause harm, I think has been really a test to continue to listen and to continue to value every voice in the room, to explore every opportunity that's there. But I think there's also kind of a temperament in that, it doesn't want to become commercialized. It doesn't want to become something that it isn't. And that's a delicate sort of line to walk with those that are interested and involved.
Well, and also when you talk about funding the arts, and Lily, this comes up with the Arts District, where is the revenue coming from? How, is it corporate sponsorship? Is it public money? Whose voice is being listened to when you have those conversations? People we might call underserved, are they even paying attention? Do they even care? How do you open the doors to more people and actually get them involved and get them to realize that this could improve all of our lives?
Thanks for that question. What is probably the best kept secret is every one of the organizations that inhabit the Dallas Arts District have partnerships outside of the district that go into East, West, North, and South Dallas. And I say that, I will give an example with the Dallas Symphony Orchestra that actually has their instrument. They give instruments to the children, and the musicians and the young strings actually give them lessons. That has continued even through COVID. Luckily, virtually, they could still get the lessons, but and one of the graduates from Booker T. Washington helped, Erica Badu helped with a fundraiser to make sure that a program like that continues. The importance of going into the neighborhoods and taking the value of what we know the arts have to every aspect of the city of Dallas is really, and I say it's the best kept secret, but it's time for us to actually work together so that everyone benefits. And the Nasher has a partnership, and not just one, there are multiple partnerships. The beauty of Dallas Arts District, I would say, is having a high school for the arts in the district. Talk about leveling the playing field. These buildings are very beautiful and can be formal, but when school is about to start, or when the bell rings for them to release, all of a sudden the Dallas Arts District becomes this major playground that puts us, really gives us a perspective of that it cannot be a formal place, which is why we want block parties, street activations, things that happen outside of the buildings, so that audiences that come into the street block parties or the street activations actually feel less intimidated. So the symphony was doing noontime actual free performances featuring local artists with their musicians. And the beauty of that is that everyone gets to experience that gorgeous lobby of the Meyerson Symphony Center. And it is extremely important now that we're partnering. And when you talked about revenue, we're partnering with everyone. It's corporate, it's residential, it's restaurants, it's the hotel, it's and certainly Dallas has a very strong philanthropic community, and not just to the Dallas Arts District. And I will speak to that in terms of TACA is an organization that gives grants, and a lot of the philanthropists give to that organization. They have done 3 different COVID relief grant distributions just in the past few months. And they completely pivoted their formal grant application to pop-up arts grants that happen every month. And they actually said they were only going to do 2 a month. Each month they've given at least double. 4 organizations get a couple of $1,000s, but it makes a huge difference as we're all recovering. So when we talk about revenue, and right now there is no revenue, but I will tell you, it has humbled everyone, not to the point that we're going back to our silos, to the point that we have one of the most collaborative, and I would really start that with, what was it, Lizzie, 3 years ago when we started the whole research on the cultural plan and the steering committee. That actually brought us all together to a place where we had to voice opinions and listen a ton. And because that cultural plan was so inclusive with residents, and it was extremely inclusive, that drove this collaborative spirit. And I really do believe that together we're all going to survive this. It's not about one organization surviving post-pandemic. It really is this collaborative spirit. And the one thing that I know that Dallasites have, and Texans have in general, is we're going to be the best and the brightest when it's all said and done. It's going to be the biggest and the largest. It's going to come around, and Texans really do believe that. It's a funny kind of situation, but I do think that COVID has brought to the reality of the world this global need for arts and culture in the cities.
Well, and hopefully it brings out the best in us as we move forward.
Agreed.
but and I have to say, you mentioned the Dallas Arts District becoming a playground when the kids get out of school. I ran a story in the magazine a few years ago on the Arts District, and commissioned a photo essay. Leonard, who photographed the Thanksgiving Square, photographed that as well. And one of the things he fixated on was the kids skating outside the high school. And yeah, another great line is from our photographer friend Leonard, is that great architecture is architecture that you can skate, right? It's like there's that generous portion on the exterior that everyone can access and that can be used in perhaps ways that it was not originally intended for. But it makes people feel more comfortable, and it breaks down that formality.
I definitely agree with that.
Thank you. Lizzie, so, we still can't let Dallas or ourselves here in Texas off the hook when it comes to equity, which is a large part of your talk was about. That includes, and this includes like acknowledging the problems of the past, you know, our legacy of racism, and how that is still legible in our built environment. You talk about Dallas liking to erase histories. At the same time, it's written very plainly in the way that the city is laid out. You think, just look back in the Dallas Morning News a week or two ago with Mark Lamster's big story on Joppy. And here's a community that's been completely cut off and left out. And so these things are still happening. This isn't something that's in the past. And that's what we're seeing with social uprising all around us right now. So, but the question for architecture is, again, how do you heal? What can architecture bring to the table when combating something like structural racism?
That's a big question. So I guess I wanted to revisit what you'd said before about kind of do no harm. And so I think it's important, you know, we can't be blind to the harm that's already been done. We have to understand that. We have to know it. And I think as architects, that's something that we all have the capability to do. We have to have the will to do it. And I think we also, you know, in order to not do harm, we have to be able to see the potential for the harm to be done. And so part of that is that a lot of us, you know, we don't know how racist we are. You know, we haven't done the work to be able to truly see the potential for the harm that we could be doing, because we don't know to look for it. We don't know what it looks like. We don't know, you know, we haven't done the work. And so, you know, I've been thinking about this a lot in my career, but like especially the last couple of months. And you know, we're people before we're architects. And so part of it is what can we do as architects? Part of it is what can we do as people? And so I think, you know, we all need to do the work of like the anti-racist work to become anti-racist architects if we're not on that path already. And so that's part of it, is being able to potentially see the world with new eyes, or you know, a way of seeing that we haven't been seeing before, and that might transform our practice in how we approach our work, in the kind of work that we do, and the kind of work that we take on, and the partners that we take on. Who do we take money from? All of that kind of stuff. And that starts to blur the lines, because I think as architects, you know, I think we have a tendency to think about architects as being, you know, world shapers, city makers, you know, but then when it comes down to it, we say, well, we are service providers, we're tools of capitalism. We have to do what we have clients. But there's also agency in that. And so, you know, understanding our agency and understanding the decisions that we're making that impact. So I think that's part of it. And I think understanding, you know, this goes back to understanding the harm that's been done. We're not working with blank slates. You know, nothing that we work on is a tabula rasa. And we've had this tendency, you know, in Dallas, but also as architects it's a blank slate, you know, but it's not. So figuring, you know, building that into our process of understanding and kind of changing the way that we sort of see the world, just as easy as you know, changing how we do everything and the way that we operate.
Right. Yeah. So basically change everything and then we'll be okay. So,
I mean, it kind of, it does need to happen, you know, like we do need to change. We need to change, you know, we have climate change, we have, like crippling racism. We have, we have all these things, and we have agency as people and as architects to be able to make these changes. We just need to do it.
Right. So, I think part of what you're trying to say is that if architects are going to change the world for the better, first architects need to change themselves, and that starts with the internal firm cultures, and we're certainly not all there yet.
I think that's a big, I think that's a big part of it. I mean, we have work to do as individuals, we have work to do as firms, we have work to do as communities, we have work to do as a culture of architects, as a profession. And so it's, for the long haul, it's not going to be quick, but I think it's imperative, and we can support each other in doing that. But yeah, I think that's where I'd start.
Thank you, Lizzie. And this dovetails with something that from your talk, Florian, when you talked about the idea of designing for culture and this question of authenticity. And immediately after you mentioned authenticity, you go to a slide about ethics. And this idea of ethics and authenticity being combined in the way that we're thinking of culture today. Like, you can't go to a museum without also having social problems and environmental problems put into your face. Art is addressing it these days. The art that we're favoring is addressing it. And so now, as we design for art and culture, we have to think about ethics. The project you did in Atlanta includes habitat for birds as well as for human beings. So I want you to talk a bit about that a bit deeper. This idea that ethics doesn't just end with human relations, but also extends to the natural world.
I know people mentioned it after an hour and a half talking, people start to peel off, but the questions that you're asking could have us go for a while. I don't know if there's questions from the audience, but maybe you should see. But anyway, no, I think let's see, I would like to pick up on the conversation of the ethics of the architect to an extent. And maybe when I came to this country, somebody told me every line you draw is a potential lawsuit, which was a very interesting way to think about it as an architect when I came here. But now we realize every line you draw has social and environmental implications. I joined a group that is trying to rid the construction industry of involuntary labor practices, and has a lot to do with looking at supply chain and understanding, how do the things that we specify, because that's where the agency is of the architect, what we specify, that actually sets in motion a certain level of economic, social, and environmental realities. And so getting much more, and it's like learning, it's the work that you're saying we need to do. We need to know when we draw a line, what are the implications of that line, not just as a physical boundary in space, which we spoke about, we need to tear down certain walls, but also with that line that turns into material, and those material, that material has an incredible impact on so many different systems. So that's to an extent, but we have been focusing on quite a bit recently and really understanding better, how to specify things, because that's where the agency, I think, is of the architect. And the second thing that we've done recently, so I was upset during the Black Lives Matter protests in New York when all the institutions boarded up. And so there was plywood everywhere. And I thought, wait, it's funny because all these lobbies and all these, public spaces of museums are always called atria and fora. And, they use these public names as metaphors, as if it is sort of a public, open to the public, but it wasn't, because it was all boarded up, and there was all fear that, the actual role of public space would be enacted upon in those places that were called plaza or forum or what have you. And so I wrote a upset piece about that. And in the end I said, but what are we going to do with all this plywood afterwards? And so then we came across this organization called Reply, and they were collecting all this plywood. And then we actually partnered up with the Urban Design Forum, because they were very interested in having architects volunteer in neighborhoods that were hardest hit by COVID. And so we went into Jackson Heights, which is one of the most diverse neighborhoods in New York and in the country for that matter. And we worked with all the businesses there that had been shut to help them figure out how they could reopen safely with barriers, with furniture. And we used all the plywood that was recycled to actually build whole new sort of setups for these businesses. And so that was, you know, literally, I think the sort of shift for ourselves that also happened is like, rather than maybe, it was a shift where I realized our institutions really need to re-engage with sort of an audience beyond what they know, and indeed, you know, think more ethically about what their role is in society that is rapidly changing and needs urgent care. Yeah.
Well, on that note, I think we are at an hour and a half about in our talk now. I haven't seen any questions from the audience. I don't know if there's an audience left. So I think that now would be a good time to wrap up. To thank our panelists for coming together today. It was a really wonderful conversation. We brought up so many huge issues, only brushed the surface. So it's food for more conversation to come. So thank you, and thank you for anyone who's still maybe watching. Good night.